Hey guys, we are back, and today we are talking about media theory and research, and this is an area that I'm particularly fascinated by, so I'm excited to go through this with you. I wanted to read you a few statistics. They're actually listed in your textbook before we start, so I didn't type all these up in the PowerPoint, but I'll go ahead and pull the PowerPoint up so you don't have to stare at my giant face while we're doing this. Alrighty. Let's see, present. Oh, back. Okay, so here's some statistics that I think you'll find intriguing. Americans spend an average of just over 10 hours a day staring at a screen, and about half of that is watching television or some form of video entertainment, like the entertainment behind me. Jack, please move out of the way. By age 75, the average American will have spent 9 years of his or her life watching television or some kind of video, which that just, I'm not sure, it kind of terrifies me, but also I dig it. By age 18, a child has seen on TV 200,000 acts of violence, including 40,000 acts of murder. So that's for the average child. 47% of violent actions include no depiction of pain. And 54% of children in the mid-1990s had a television set in their own bedroom and often watched with a friend unsupervised, which is totally me and maybe a bunch of you too. All right, go on over there, Jack, so I can do this. Okay, so those are some statistics that we've gotten from media research. So today I want to go through different theories and sort of where we're at with research. If you're thinking about your final exam essay and you don't have a particular topic in mind yet, I think that there's a lot to draw from today. You can certainly choose whatever topic you like, but there's a lot of good stuff today in terms of theories you could apply or research that you could look into. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about theories of communication. So when we talk about theories of communication, we have to start with our old friend Aristotle. And Aristotle created what's referred to as the rhetorical triangle. So the rhetorical triangle consists of the author, which is the writer, the context or the text, and then the audience, and that all three have to be connected and are of equal importance in communication. And he tied these to, or we tie them to the three elements of rhetoric that we've discussed before. Ethos, which is credibility, which of course is associated with the writer-author. Logos, which is logic and reason, which is connected to the context or the text. And then pathos, the audience. That's, of course, the emotional appeals. So we start with the rhetorical triangle. Also, in terms of theories of communication, there are transmission models of communication, which vary from complex to simplified, basically how information is transmitted from the creator to the receiver. And there's a simplified communications model that was created in 1954 that basically states that communication begins at a source that encodes a message. It's transmitted via the media, and then it is decoded by the recipient. So it's just a simple model of communication. Now, other theories of communication include critical theory and cultural studies, and we're going to talk a little bit more about these later, but critical theory was broadly influenced by Marxist notions with ideology, exploitation, capitalism, and the economy influencing society. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then cultural studies, which rejects the scientific approach while investigating the role of culture in maintaining and creating social relations and systems of power. That one I find particularly intriguing, but a lot of criticism comes to cultural studies because of its rejection of the scientific approach. Pause. All right, I'm back. That might happen a couple times. Sorry, guys. Okay, back to it. Limited effects research. All right, so let's start by talking about, hold on, let me go back. I know I skipped something. Media effects research. So this is exactly what it sounds like, studying the effects of media exposure. And this type of research has influenced the movie rating system as we have it now, regulations for television, including like the rating system that we have on television, and types of advertisements that we view. So this is probably the type of research that you would be most familiar with, just that you've encountered in your interactions with media. So when we talk about media effects research, we really start back around World War I with the use of propaganda. And we've talked about propaganda before. I know that you've studied propaganda surely in history class and other communications courses you may have taken, but it's that kind of control through media over people's thoughts and actions, and just sort of a heavy-handed influence. What you may not have heard of before is something called the hypodermic needle model, and that is the idea that media, particularly propaganda, can inject an idea into society, very much the way a needle injects something into the body. And those messages will have a huge impact and widespread. The Pain Fun studies, which took place between 1928 and 1933, studied the impact of film viewing on children. And what they discovered was that the impact on children, for positive or negative, really depended on a lot of social factors and personal factors. So their background, their ethnic, racial background, the social environment in which they were being raised, and also their parent influence. And so film viewing, didn't have the same effect on all children, but they did begin to see correlations with these different aspects of their lives and the context. They also discovered that there can be positive lessons learned through media and retained as well. So when you think of something like that, if you take something as squeaky clean as Sesame Street, right? There can be positive lessons, but the impact of the lessons on Sesame Street will vary depending on variable aspects of the child's life. Radio research really picked up when the War of the Worlds incident occurred, which we talked about in a couple videos ago, I think, and we've talked about it as well back when we discussed Citizen Kane in 1938, when Orson Welles' Spectrum Theater Group performed War of the Worlds, and the people who missed the beginning, saying that it was a fictional performance, believed that it was real, and it caused some mass hysteria. So, so that created that began more of the radio. What is the effect of the listener through what's conveyed through radio communication? And then in terms of television and violence, this is an interesting one. So in the 1950s, there was something called the Bobo doll studies, and they exposed children, like one group of children, to a TV episode where violence was rewarded. And then there was a second group of children that were exposed to TV shows where the violence was punished. And they found that children viewing the TV episode where violence was rewarded were more likely to punch the Bobo doll than those who saw the violence punished. Now, there are a lot of variables in this, a lot of room for misleads, but something that was quite interesting was that they could not account for the effects after the children left the lab. And so whether or not there was a long-lasting effect was never proven in this study. It was just a sort of immediate response to what they had just seen. So I find that quite intriguing. Okay, limited effects research. Cultivation analysis. This is the idea that TV cultivates a view of reality similar to that presented on TV. So the idea that it's a cumulative effect. So the idea that if you watch a lot of soap operas on television, then you begin to see reality in this sort of soap opera way and desire to have those kinds of experiences in your life in terms of romance, for example. The idea that if we see enough representation on television, for example, if we see a large amount of representation of LGBTQIA+ characters, then maybe we'll begin to see to be more open to seeing the reality of the diversity of people that are in our world. Now, this kind of a negative effect too. I'll get you a snack in just a minute, buddy. Not you guys. Sorry, I can't do anything about that. He's so reasonable. I can get him any kind of snack I want to get him. Okay, I'll get that in just a minute, bud. Now, the negative effects of this is what's referred to as the mean world syndrome, which is the idea that if you watch enough, negative television or scary things, then you begin to fear the world. So if you're someone who watches every iteration of Law and Order or CSI, and this is all you watch, that you may begin to view the world as a scary and dangerous place. The 24-hour news cycle has had this kind of effect as well. And you see this happening particularly in groups like senior citizens who watch a lot of television and they are tending to more and more stay inside and stay away and be more fearful of the world outside of them. And a lot of that is because of what they see every day. Okay, well, I can't worry about that right now. Okay, the spiral of silence. This explains why people may be unwilling to publicly express opinions they feel if they believe that they're in the minority. And the three tenets of this are natural fear of isolation. So part of this theory assumes that we have a natural fear of isolation, and that out of that fear, we're afraid to share our minority views because we're afraid that will isolate us further from the majority. It also hinges on an understanding that people have a sort of sixth sense or just a way of feeling, being able to gauge the climate of opinion and to determine what the majority views are. And so the spiral of silence assumes that we can kind of tell if we're in the minority and that we're afraid to express those views because we're afraid of being isolated. I can see that this is, I think we can see this right now in the world. I get on social media and someone says something and everybody's saying it, and I feel differently, and I absolutely do not post that because I'm just not interested in being attacked or excluded in any way. So I'm not exactly the same thing, but I can see where that might be. So that's called the spiral of silence. There's a lot of research on that. And then there's also a lot of research on the third person effect, which is the tendency for people to underestimate the effect of a persuasive message on themselves while they're overestimating the effect on others. So an example would be that during World War II, the Japanese created this propaganda campaign where they, this was right before Iwo Jima, and they dropped a bunch of leaflets onto Black servicemen who were going to take part in the campaign. And the leaflets were saying that the Japanese were fighting white oppression, and it was trying to appeal to the Black soldiers, to appeal to their ethnicity. And so it didn't work. No soldiers defected, and mm-hmm. Yes, so it was ineffective. However, the white leadership of those soldiers just went about and collected all of the pamphlets from the combat area to avoid this sort of loss of morale. And so that's just an example because the leadership had overestimated the effect on their soldiers. But anyway, so that's just an example. All right, criticisms of media effects research. So, you know, the first statement's really talking about things like Columbine, school shootings, the shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. When one of those tragedies happens, one of the first things we hear is about the killer's media. What did they say on social media? What have they been watching? What have they been playing? When we look back at the Columbine massacre, so much of that conversation, which we've discussed before, was about what the games that those boys were playing, what movies they were watching. Were they watching The Matrix? What music were they listening to? Was it Marilyn Manson? And so we always go to media as the explanation. A criticism of media effects is that it seems to purport the belief that the audience has no will of its own, that we're all just susceptible to the effects of media on us, and we can't think for ourselves and make determinations for ourselves. Another criticism is, how do we measure media exposure? You can ask people to self-report, but I mean, that's, Jack, please don't play with that. Sorry. But is that really valid data? And then the risk of examining the wrong dimension of the communications process, right? If we're doing the media effects, then we're leaving out looking at the whole picture of communication, like we talked about before, the progression. All right, understanding the audience. And you know, I just love talking about audience understanding. This area questions the notion that media comes with predetermined and unchangeable meaning. So it purports the notion of active participation from the audience. So it's not that the media is telling us these things and we're just hearing them just as they're presented. It's how we're interpreting them too. So uses and gratification research looks at why people use particular media. People have certain needs which they try to satisfy through media, particularly psychological needs. So the idea being, if someone watches a lot of reality romance shows? Is it because they have this sort of psychological need for a grand romance story, or because they want romance in their lives, and so they're finding it this way? If someone watches a lot of sort of hero-based shows, is it because they have this psychological need to play the role of a superhero, or to be looked at that way? So a criticism of this is circular reasoning. So which came first, the need or the media use? And that's difficult to know. The encoding decoding model states that media producers encode products with meanings, which are then decoded in various ways by various audiences. And so that's an active audience approach. There are a lot of variables in this, though. You know, who the audience is, what they're made up of, what's my background, what's my state of life, what's my socioeconomic status. You can encode your products with all the meanings you want, but every audience will decode them differently. And then reception analysis assumes that audience members are actively making meaning from media. So this one's interesting because it uses popular media. A lot of the other types of analysis and research use sort of formal media means. Reception analysis is using soap operas and reality shows and social media. It looks at the cultural and social patterns of media production and power relations between groups. And the criticism of this whole audience thing is, oh, good. Does the media actually have any power? You know, this sort of audience-focused analysis suggests that it's all us and how we interpret it, right? So you can see that some of this seems to give all the power to the media, and it seems to ignore the fact that we have our own, you know, free will and ability to analyze and interpret. And then there's a whole nother side that says, you know, maybe the media doesn't really have that much power. It's all in the way that the audience interprets it. So we've got a whole spectrum here. And then what about framing? So we've talked about framing several times, and framing, there's been a lot of research on framing, and I find framing fascinating. Something that you might consider for a research paper, just an area of interest that I would have done if we'd been in class and had more time together, is to go to the Pulitzer Prize website for journalistic photography, and to look at the photographs there and how they are framed. So there's one that I often use as an example. Oh, I should have had it pulled up. Actually, you know what? I'm going to show you. Hang on. Okay, so I'm back. And let me show you a couple of, let's get the screen share back on. Let me show you a couple of things. Oh, look, there's that. We'll just use that later. Okay, so here's the, oh my goodness, not right now. Here's the Pulitzer Prize, pulitzer.org. This is feature photography. So this is one that I particularly like to use. There's a couple on here I want to show you. And it's this image here. So the framing is really important in this image. So the caption tells us that this is he's cradling his injured elbow. Later, he had a change of heart after speaking with the commander. He saw a possibility to escape his enlistment only 2 days in. From his first day in fatigues through his days driving a Humvee in Iraq, military life often didn't mesh with his expectations. Sometimes the structure and demands of training for war clashed with the freedom he shared with his outside friends. But the framing of this photo is exactly what we're talking about, just in visual form. Right? So the photographer could have taken this picture any number of ways. He could have been centered, but he's not. He's off to the side, which suggests confusion. That's a photography and film kind of analysis. The empty army chair, right? That he doesn't feel a part of things, or like someone's there with him. You've got, you know, I want you here, right, for the army, pointing out at the viewer. And there he sits to the side, looking very vulnerable. You've got the clock because of time, the time aspect of what's being used here, or perhaps the perception of it being wasted. Fire escape, because that's what he's trying to do as well, is to escape this role that he's taken, right? And then once I had a student point out that this looked like a little noose, and yeah, it does. So you can make of that what you will, but it's the framing, right? This could have been framed completely differently. The fire escape didn't need to be in there. The other chair, Jack, please stop. The framing matters is my point. Okay, let me show you another one if I can. This website gets a little persnickety on me sometimes. Let's see, I want to show you one, and these go way back. You can spend a lot of time on here, and you maybe should, because it's very, very good. Let's see, I really wanted to show, I'm too far back. Man, some of these I have to tell you, though, are devastating. So just know that when you look through them. There are a lot of war, families, people dying. So just be mindful of what you're looking at, too. Man, I can't, hold on. It's actually really important to me that I show you this one. Up. You can listen to Jack sing while I'm looking. Pulitzer Prize photography. Here we go. There's some great photographs from after Hurricane Katrina, and one of my, there's several here that I think are just fantastically framed. This one with the bridge that looks like it goes to nowhere, right? Everything she has here, her clothes are too big. She's going uphill, right, not down. There's some really sad ones on here. I'm going to flip by them quickly to get to the ones, a couple that I would like to show you. This is the one that I use a lot in terms of framing, right? So this is, they're standing on the roof of a building. And everything about the composition of this photograph is fantastic. Just the way that it was framed, right? The water is rising, please, which is an not on purpose play on words. You've got the American flag, so the color popping out against the black of the rooftop, right? The flag that's crumbled on the ground, right? She's trying to wave the flag to get people's attention, right? They're all dressed in white. There's a vulnerability about the angle as they're all looking up, right? As if help is coming from the sky. This was clearly taken by a helicopter, and then help as well. So the framing really shows the vulnerability of the people, you know, lying down and all of them looking up and holding their flags and hoping that the government will come and help them. And so that one's just, it's very poignant. All right, so framing. In 1984, there was a study in message framing, so not photography framing, but sort of messaging. And 2 groups were given scenarios. Well, there was one scenario that there was a disease outbreak and that, I can't remember exactly, maybe 600 million, let's see, 400, hold on, let me make sure. Yes, 600 people were going to be killed. I read this the other day and I thought this is just wild that this is the example in the book, considering where we are right now. But 2 groups were given 2 different scenarios. One was a gain framed scenario. And so that was, it emphasized saving lives. So option A would save 200 people, whereas option B specified a 1/3 probability of saving everyone, but a 2/3 probability of saving no one. And people chose A, so less risk. Another group was given a loss-framed scenario, which emphasized loss. So option A would kill 400 people, while option B had a 1/3 probability of killing no one, but a 2/3 probability of killing everyone. And a large majority chose option B, which is the risky option. And so that just tells you the way that it's framed, either as a gain or a loss, made a difference in people's choices. So there is actually a lot of power in framing. Okay. Moving on. Okay, cultural studies. Cultural studies rejects media effects. The culture industry propagates an ideology that helps maintain the status quo. This is the idea of cultural studies, that it makes the culture industry, communications, makes existing power relationships and inequality look natural and discourages critical reflection among people. Oh, I didn't close my parentheses. I'm the worst at that. And the organization that was really studying this, which was the Frankfurt School, believed that high art, and they separated art into low art and high art, which can seem kind of snooty, but it was part of the deal. They believed that high art encouraged reflection and encouraged critical discussion amongst people about power systems, but that a lot of media was focused on low art, and that a lot of that low art really normalized inequality and the existing power structures that we have. So for example, when you look at media, you know, how much of media shows the inequality between the majority and minority populations in the United States, right? Do we see a lot of that in low art sort of pop culture, or does our pop culture just is it just, you know, everything as usual? And so the cultural studies folks believe that media actively creates popular desires and suppresses freedom, that the media really has the ability to tell us what we want our lives to be like. And in that way, they're suppressing our freedom to choose. Also, and so some of this study was done in like Nazi Germany, for example, but the argument is also that this occurs in democratic free market systems because the media of mass communication promotes a capitalist ideology and ignores or downplays negative consequences of capitalist economies. I mean, look at a lot of the media that you see and, you know, really think about that. To what extent is this promoting a capitalist ideology? Where do I see criticisms of capitalist ideology? The cultural studies folks say that you don't see enough of it and that that's a problem. Now, criticism of this type of analysis is actually the writing style, because a lot of the writings in cultural studies are so full of jargon and so complex in their usage and structure that they're almost impossible to read because they write in this sort of high art way. But also that this means of analysis rejects scientific tenets, such as the use of reason, and it really just gives it all over to the cultural aspects. That's a criticism of cultural studies. Socio-historical frameworks examine the entire media system within a larger social, political, historical context. One of the premises of this is the idea of an information society, that the prominence of communications and media has ushered in a new era apart from the industrial, and that now the success relies so heavily on education and training as opposed to skills and vocational skills like it used to be. And a criticism of the concept of the system, looking at the media system as part of an informational society, is that once again, it strengthens the established relations of dominance as global media corporations control more media channels. So for an information society, well, all right, but what does that mean for us when there are these huge media corporations and conglomerates that are really in control? Is there really a free exchange of speech or of information in society, or is it all controlled by the higher ups? And then another criticism would be that when you study information, when you look at something through the lens of information society, you're really looking at a small segment of the world's population. The digital divide is real regarding access to the internet. I mean, even electricity throughout the world. Everyone can't be part of an information society because they don't have access to information. So what do we do with that? The political economy examines the production and ownership of media that determine our media environment and affects us socially and politically. Media ecology is the study of media environments and their effects, and this is where the concept of a global village comes about, and the question if technology causes certain human behaviors. And then agenda setting, which is, hold on, suspense. Actually, you can read it. So agenda setting. This is an interesting one we could spend all day on, but don't worry, we will not. So this is the idea that communication, the media, determines which topics the public deems important, that the media really sets the agenda for our society. So there's a great quote I want to read you from a political scientist, Bernard Cohen, who said, "The press may not be successful much of the time in telling people what to think, but is stunningly successful in telling its readers what to think about." And so, you know, think about that for a moment and ask yourself, has your experience on social media, for example, prompted you to participate in something that you may not have before? Particularly like something related to activism. If so, then there's a study there on agenda setting as well. All right, and then the evolving role of the audience. So this is changing, and there's a lot of research going on right now because of this influx of user-generated content. It used to be that only certain groups controlled what was in the media, and now we all do. So how is that changing? How does that work within these various analytic frameworks? Social media and social movements, as we were just saying. So something like Arab Spring or Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, right? How has social media affected these social movements and activism in general? Social networking, how does that change our identity formation and our presentation of ourselves to the world? I mean, you've probably all seen those images of the memes of where it has like 4 pictures and it's Facebook, Instagram, I don't remember what the other one is, and LinkedIn, and how people present themselves differently in different platforms. But also in terms of social networking, what effect is that actually having on our identity formation? In becoming who we want to be, or in becoming what we perceive that the world wishes for us to be, which is, you know, an eternal struggle, but what impact has social media had on that tension? And there's a lot of research right now on video games and whether or not video games reinforce stereotypes, what effect they have on our sense of identity, and also how we learn. Do we actually learn better by doing something like through a video game as opposed to traditional learning methods? And then, of course, there's research on the impact of violence, although you'll be interested to know that there is much less research on the impact of violence than the impact of violence. There's less research going on the impact of violence in video games than there is on the impact of violence on television, which I find super interesting and maybe out of touch. All right, so that's just an overview of theory and research. So like I said, if you're looking for a topic for your final exam paper and you either don't have a topic or you have like sort of a broad topic you want to write about, but you don't know how to go about it, you might choose one of these schools of thought and apply it. And, you know, what would this school of theory, how would they read this, or what would they say? You might look at some of these topics we've talked about that are currently in research. Anyway, hopefully I gave you some ideas for this. I love theory, I love research, love talking about it. I'm going to put an activity on Moodle and a question in the forum for you. And I really look forward to seeing what you have to say about this. So talk to you soon, guys. More to come, and hope you're doing well. See you soon.